We have two great plenary talks lined up for you for today. Our first presentation is more of a practice view on systemic design, and our second presentation is a bit more reflective around some of the theory and how we're framing systemic design. But without further ado, I would like to introduce Maria Davidová, and she will be presenting a presentation together that she's created together with Kateřina Zímová, but as unfortunately, Kateřina is not able to join us today as something last minute came up. But both Kateřina and her, who are an architect and landscape ecologist, respectively, are part of the collaborative collective. And they are going to share with us a practice-based systemic design project that they have worked on together in Prague using co-design with both humans and non-human actors. So please take it away, Maria. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Josina. Well, hello from cloudy Cardiff, where I am located now, but I will take you to Prague. I heard the weather is not that good there either. I would first start with a video from Kateřina, because she is very sad she cannot be here today, and she just recorded video to be with you and tell you hello. Please put your volume up because it's very low volume.
During our speech with Maria Davidová, but I will hope you will enjoy our great project. So have a nice time and see you.
Okay, so that was from Kateřina, and then I will get to our presentation. So I will take you to Prague 22 municipality, to the project which we call COLreg, the collaborative regenerative region. We will be discussing something what Liz Sanders and Peter Steppers discussed, that the designing moved first from designing of things towards interactions and towards systems, which also involves that the design moved from designing for people to designing with people and by people. And what will be the discussion about is about bioregioning, and what about Takara discuss as an activity that creates value. We will be connecting what is with what if. This is actually quotation from Takara article, but I was notified by somebody that it was actually Hopkins who said that first. So sorry for my low knowledge. So I will refer to Takara at the moment. This is the region. This is a region that Prague 22 bought from a private owner in order to connect biocorridor across its land between a deer park and along the river, and crossing basically the directions I'm showing here through the landscape, in order to make a public park. Originally, this area has been a private land that has been occupied by gardening colony, which is a very nice thing, but it has been fenced, and nobody, neither humans nor non-humans, had access to that. But it has excellent genius lots. You can see beautiful gardening colony where people were doing their thickenings across the gardens, and actually having it's very nice sort of environment to be in. So what we did, of course, the municipality didn't want to go. They want to support their community. They don't want to go against their community, which means also involving the people who do the gardening colony. So we did. I was hired to actually do co-designing workshops on how this region could be used. So we had first this gigamapping workshop that was involving critical expert stakeholders such as ecologists and people from municipalities, so on. And then the community representatives, such as representatives of the gardening colony and people from local schools and similar things, discussing how we can connect the what is with what if. So the way how I work is that I invite those people. Each of them has, and in this case of this project, they had quite defined agendas. Those people really had an opinion what should happen with this region. So first I asked everybody to draw the mini map of what they want the project to develop, to map their own universe, how they think, what they want in the area. And then we would have presentation across the board, what is their sort of agenda in that field. Then they get the scissors and they are asked to actually find for relationships and group things which are similar agendas and what they think are controversial agendas, and generate a gigamap together with grouping those interests and finding relationships and finding what could be the relationship between who and what. So within the meantime, whilst I was doing this gigamapping workshop with the stakeholders, I was in Prague with my students from Cardiff, and Kateřina, the landscape ecologist, was actually making a workshop for them, where she was teaching them how to map the ecosystem of the region and how to map the urban design of the region. So they have been mapping, localizing different fences in the region where species cannot move, and mapping the species, what is in the area. And she would tell you more about, but unfortunately she can't be here. At the end of the day, we all met together and discussed our mapping together and discussed what could be synergetic solution for all. And after some reflections and evaluating of what has been mapped, we had a second gigamapping workshop that already involves presentation of integration of both of the mappings. And that workshop was already fully open to public. So again, the people were presented what has been already mapped and what has been discussed between the most interested groups, and they had to work with those topics and mapping what are their agendas and what would be there. Again, mapping their own mini maps and then relating that to gigamaps, finding relations. What I always work with is actually, because specifically realizing that with my students, they realize that when they draw arrow, I am happy. So I ask everybody to interpret the relationship. So whenever you draw an arrow, you write an interpretation of the relationships. So you get better understanding and people get understanding what they mean by those relationships when they are drawing them. So then came actually my role, not only as a facilitator, but as somebody who would synergize all those outcomes from the mapping. So I, as a systemic designer, integrated this into the gigamap, where I mapped the most common agendas that were very often those people actually believed they are very much against each other, and they found out that they are actually very much in line, and in fact everybody agreed they want a pub. That would be the most common agreement. Again, we are in Czechia, right? So pub was the most common, but there were agendas like some people wanted to have their more individual spaces, like where they can be sort of like their introvert space in the park. Some people wanted to have have space for collective events and so on. And it is, of course, possible to integrate all those things. This gigamap is exhibited in the gigamapping gallery of RSD, so you can go into detail to that. The most collective thing was, this is actually a picture from Cardiff, keeping the gardening at the place that could be collective, and actually creating sort of circular economy around or token economy around those things. So here are the most important stakeholders that have been mapped. That would be the city hall, the community, the integrated person in a need. You need somebody who takes care of the area, and in the same time you should there has been agreed across everybody, you should do something for the people that are not in the perfect situation. There would be local school, there would be mapped bird, deer, because there is a deer park nearby, hedgehogs and insects, and all those agents actually have feedback loops within the agenda. So the city hall would provide a cabin that is there for the person on need that doesn't have where to live. They give her or him the gardening space. In the same time, that will secure that the region will be safe, though we would be actually removing those fences so we can get a biocorridor across. There would be deer playing role of mowing when we remove the fences. There would be insects that would be pollinating the gardens. There would be school that can study those all those species. In the same time, those species would actually take care of the school garden where the community can grow garden, and those things are circulating and having different roles. So if I get to the part which I call sort of individual, and I made a gradient across the neighborhood, so there would be the cabins for people in need who don't have home to actually live there and do service for the community, but actually it would generate their jobs. There would be cabins that would be used for sort of Airbnb, which people can do their introvert weekend and spend their time. The intervention was also to start collecting rainwater and making compost toilets. The most important things is that the fences open, and there would be bird pools and meadows to support the economy across the species. Then there would be collective part with the stage for collective events. Obviously, the garden restaurant where people from their gardening for the token economy that has been designed for that can deliver what they have rests, and they would be producing food, ciders, things like this. There would be community garden specifically for the people who used to have their garden, school garden, and so on, whilst actually all that region would perform on circular economy and token economy that would be integrating all actors across the species. So this is the region where this is the more private part. This is the more collective part.
What I'm wondering is, तो ये सारे बच्चे हैं कि कुर्सियां हैं, या मैं confused हो गई?
What? Probably nothing. Okay. Okay. So the only physical intervention except collecting the rainwater would be actually removing the fences, and the discussion is actually really like literally connected. There, everything is left there, and asking questions. What if with a very abstract system? So what if we generate a circular token-based economy for the area? Start collecting water for humans and non-humans. generate shared, intimate, and open spaces, produce exchangeable services? Can we give homes and farming and business space to people in the need for producing the services and generating security in the area? Can we give vegetable gardens to school and community members? Can we give tokens to butterflies for pollinating your gardens? Can they buy and support blooming meadows for that? Can we pay the deers for mowing them? Can a bird buy an insect hotel being its fast food restaurant? Our life on Earth can flourish only with cross-species participation. However, today economic models do not seem to recognize other than human agency in it. So let's start connecting what is with what if. So thank you very much. If you are interested in the publications in the field, you can follow us both on ResearchGate. These are the QR codes to follow us. And thank you. I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you very much, Maria, for that presentation. Super interesting to see how you negotiate all of those different interests in a park. There's a few questions coming in, so I'd like to take a couple now before we move to the next speaker, and then if there's time at the end, we'll also come back between both Peter and you and take some further questions. But Antonio had an interesting question about, you mentioned this kind of alignment versus division or conflict in what people were bringing forward. And Antonio's question was, what contributes to this realization? And a kind of supporting that, an overarching question of, did you do anything in relation to self-governance or how people came to these realizations or decisions?
Well, the thing is, I mean, in a way, it the first definition, it was kind of top-down project where the municipality bought the land and decided to do some bioregioning in it. But in the same time, and specifically because Kateřina lives in that place, she told them it will never work unless you integrate people, and please invite Maria to do this workshop to actually integrate people and get them together. So actually it started as a very conflict-based projects. Basically, those people from the gardening colony just said, we are unhappy, we're not gonna talk to you, we hate you, and bye. So the thing was, then the representative of them anyway came to that workshop. They were actually, I was like, and the city hall was organizing that, and I was saying, you have to get them to come. You have to get somebody to come. And they were saying, no, we are not coming. We are unhappy and we hate you. And whatever change happens, we don't agree. So when actually the representatives of group like that or other groups came, they were actually surprised that they don't need to be in conflict, that in fact if they can be still growing their vegetables in that area, maybe there are changes, maybe there will be differences from what was, but if they actually start cooperating, they don't need to lose everything what they did. So they actually, it was sort of like a wow moment for them, like it is not a fight, it is actually search for synergy.
Great, thank you. I'm going to combine a couple of questions that were coming in. Eve was asking about kind of more practically around this sort of participatory giga mapping process and what sort of instructions were given to people. Were people mainly doing, you called them kind of like mini maps, were people mainly doing their own and then connecting down the road, or what sort of instructions? And then with that, Christine was asking a question about children, and that struck me also in one of your photos, quite a young child with some of the older folks integrating in there. So also connecting Eve's question, like how did you instruct people to do this giga mapping process, and then how do you authentically involve children in that process?
Yeah, I mean, people who come to that workshop come up with incredible anxiety. They are scared that they cannot draw because they haven't never been trained to draw. They are scared. You know, you move them from their areas of expertise. They are used to do the things they do, and they get very anxious. What if I embarrass myself not drawing a nice enough rabbit, or things like this. I mean, and that was something at RSD 7 Dumini Pereira was having beautiful paper about, is resolving those things with humor. So and you know, I would always do that. I've never reflected on that before I heard her presentation, that actually, you know, we just ease the situations by humor. So when people start doing jokes, and it's like, yeah, we are all in fact uncomfortable and embarrassed, so let's just do things together, and then they start being explorative. And I mean, it has been several hours workshop where people were getting more and more comfortable. And to be honest, I mean, we order refreshments. So that is a very important part of those workshops, that people get themselves comfortable. They get food, they have tea, coffee, wine, and they get a bit more relaxed. I mean, kids are the easiest. They just start doing things. Forget about the difficulties with kids. They are actually quite good. I mean, the most difficult part is grown up people, because they already gained their social status, and they are scared that they will lose it by embarrassing themselves.
So it sounds like for you, it's less important was the kind of detailed instruction and more the tone setting and getting people comfortable to kind of get going with some of the drawing and things like that.
Yeah, it's about getting them comfortable, and yeah, in fact, we are a little bit all embarrassed, feeling like in a kindergarten, getting scissors and drawing rabbits. So when they actually realize that all of them are on the same boat, they get more comfortable, because they start realizing that in fact everybody is a bit scared.
Great. And kind of last question before we move on to the next presentation here, and there might be time to loop back with some further questions, but Ryan brought forward this question of like, did conflict that you mentioned, which was kind of quite a heated conflict in the beginning at least, was there any positive role that it played, or was it kind of more Eugene suggesting, were there trade-offs? Did you have to say, these people's priorities will come forward and let go of other things? What was the role of conflict? Positive in generating new ideas, or more compromising around trade-offs?
I think in a way it generates new ideas, because I think the most important role is actually that I first ask people to draw their own minimap, map their own universe, so they actually themselves start understanding what they want, and then they start presenting what is their universe. And there is a big role of empathy, that when they present their universe to each other, they start understanding what who of them wants, and then they are able to start search for synergy, because there is that empathetic shift that they actually listen to each other and start understanding to each other.
Great, thank you very much. Speaker, Peter Jones, who is one of the co-founders of the Systemic Design Association and a professor at OCAD University. And Peter's going to be talking about redesigning our theories of change and kind of questioning some of the logic models and ways that we're doing systemic storytelling. So over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Josina, and thanks, Marie, for a really interesting presentation into the ideas of bioregionalism, which is becoming more and more important. And showing up in a number of projects just over the last year. I wanted to present a talk which sounds like it's going to be theoretical, but it's really not. the theories of change that we work with in systems change initiatives are very much a matter of practice. And I wanted to get this on into our discussion in both from a point of view of good theory, but then understanding how to make a difference in practice. So I consider this our work in theories of change and changing theories of change as a way of redesigning how we think about the theories that we're asked to work with. That is, the theories of how change is made. This is the evolution of a systems practice into a design practice, because we are, after all, in systemic design. So this is the third talk on systemic theories of change that has taken place in RSD 9. I gave a first talk, which is just kind of an overview of the critiques of the practices of theories of change and how we might start to rethink theories of change in a systemic way. Our former graduate student from OCAD University's Strategic Foresight program where I teach, Ryan Murphy, gave a talk on his work in defining systemic theories of change using causal loop diagrams. And we'll look at a couple of those really briefly, but I encourage you to go back over that talk if you didn't see that. That was part 2. And then this is really a synthesis and an integration of a lot of ideas that we've been working with. Because in RSD, we often really work with this symposium as a place to work out leading ideas before we've really developed the research and published the models. So this is one of those talks where we're still really working out the ideas, and I'm interested in feedback. But I'd say this is the purpose for this talk is to get these ideas on our agenda, because I know there are many of us that are working in ever larger scales of programs, of highly complex research projects, of different social movement or change initiatives. I'm working with more and more of these, and they all come with implicit or explicit theories of change. I mean, if we look at problems of the scale of what's called the global problematique, which I just gave a talk about a couple of weeks ago, this is a 50-year-old framing from the Club of Rome of the 49, or really the many, many different problems that interconnect. We need a way of theorizing a working theory, not a scientific theory, for how transformational change occurs. And so we look at RSD and what we've learned over the years, over the 8 or 9 years, even though this is RSD 9. Our first one was really, what is this term? What do we have here? We didn't even call it systemic design for a few years. But we've gone from really this practice of relating the areas of systems thinking that we were working with for complex design from a set of core skills that really, I think, complemented and worked well in these program areas, are, highly complex programs, whether they're very often NGOs or nonprofit, but also commercial projects. But now we're working with more super complex initiatives. I know I am. And our core skills of visual mapping of complexity, giga mapping and synthesis maps, complex visual argument, process design for systemic contexts, creative multi-stakeholder engagement, all of these skills have been very well developed. But one of the things that that I haven't heard us speak about enough is how these all come together into proposals for change that actually are meaningful funding proposals and proposals for the impact that makes sense to our funders. So we could say, what are our theories of change in systems, and what is a theory of systems change? So just to go back to a theory of change, these are patterns that form a mental model, often worked out in discussion with funders or program evaluators and program sponsors, to map out the actions that lead to an envisioned systems change that's desirable for that program. And they're often defined as visual logic models that define the program actions for envisioned change. They're often oversimplified. They don't take into account systems thinking or systems theory very well. But we do call them theories of change, and now the change programs that we're being asked for from program funders are very much oriented towards systems change, not just nice change to have in the community. They're very large programs. And foundation funders, very much like venture capitalists now, not like they are that, but they require a theory of change in the same way that startup projects are required to produce a business model. So I've shown both of these are very structural logics. There's a typical theory of change on the left and a business model actually for Narana Health in India on the right, a complex business model. But we, so what can we do with new thinking and theories of change? So just to review the critique with us first. So the issues that I've experienced with theories of change in practice, that they're so oversimplified very often, these simple logic models or kind of step-by-step, that they're to the point of misdirection. We're telling stories in the sense of, a visual story that may make sense to the funder, it may make sense to us, but can they really be acted on in terms of of impact in a system in the world? But they still, in order to kind of match logic and to develop something of a visual argument, they have to be incomplete. They tend to be pretty vague, and they're optimistic. They can turn out to be just so stories, like we're believing this is the case, that change will occur through following steps A, B, C. Their linear theory of changes are linear formalisms that shape mental models towards ideal outcomes. But these can also, these outcomes have to really realize from a systems theory point of view are highly vulnerable to the real world social complexity, to what happens when we actually act in the world. And theories of change can't be guaranteed by planning in advance. When we evaluate their effectiveness, it's too late. We've already tried to carry them out. We have to act in the field of change and in our world of commitments, and in the performance of projects that are guided by a theory of change. And we then deal with the system's complexity in that field of action. Do we go back and change our theories of change and come up with new working theories? Do we look for where change is actually occurring and evaluate that and feed it back? We can't evaluate, as I said, the fitness of the theory of change, because it's too late to change the theory at that point. And if we look at examples of theories of change, if you just do an image search on logic models for theories of change, they are all fairly, most of them are pretty linear kinds of models. They look like they're systematic, as we might say, not necessarily systemic. Some of them might be, but you really have to understand what's packed into the descriptions here. And so we could just, in summary here, just say that theories of change are structured as these logic models that make a case for a system change desired by a program. Now, programs are starting to change what they want. So here there are three classical theory of change models. Now, one of the ones I showed in the first talk was Kurt Levine's organizational change model from field theory, which is to unfreeze an organization's practices, to create some movements towards new practices within an organization and refreeze those. These three I think are also, they're more contemporary and more typical. An interesting one from Jeff Mulgan from Nesta, which is perhaps more systemic. It's a cycle of moving from opportunities and challenges through delivering, scaling, and moving to systems change. But there's kind of a miracle occurs effect to these types of models. So there's something that happens in the end of that cycle. Margaret Wheatley and Deborah Freese's model of the two loops, which you'll see from time to time as well, or you'll see their work in that, but others are adopting this. So you'll see this kind of a variation of the panarchy cycle, where a dominant system is in stages of collapse or dying, and we can bring that kind of system down while we bring a new system forth. And there's this exchange of learning, and through that period of developmental work that we're doing in the change, we're looking to connect other practices, nourish the new system, and then the one on the right is crossing the chasm, which has been used a lot in startups, which is that there are early adopters which will come around for almost any program, but there's this chasm or gap that the theory of change is to cross that gap into the early majority that will then lead its market adoption. And so market adoption models and disruption models are also used in theories of change. And so, so I wanted to step through very rapidly the last 10 years of history in program development from large foundations and philanthropy work. So about 10 years ago, the development of collective impact as a model for the desired outcome for theories of change was becoming, what was on the upswing. Collective impact was based on a kind of meta theory of change that as we develop movements towards change, there will be multiple small impacts that add up to a huge collective impact. This is a type of systemic change. There was a lot of writing about this. This is still an important idea. But within less than a decade, we've seen just in the last 3 years, a real increase from foundations such as McConnell and Rockefeller and Midyar. In fact, really all of them are now thinking about forms of systems change or transformative change. And you'll see more articles in the philanthropic discussions and in, not so much in research journals, but in the philanthropy journals that are advocating approaches to systems change and large-scale systems change. And so foundations have been moving upstream in just the last 3 years towards systems change and are doing very good thinking around this, but still they aren't systems theorists. They may not be working with the latest stuff, but there's a lot of good work going on. So, I mean, I'd say they are taking into account complexity and emergence and changing the way we do theories of change towards more uncertain future outcomes. So this is a map from the McConnell Foundation's website or in publication on the movement of movements, which is very relevant to climate change and social change, that there are and economic new economies, which I'm also working with. And these are so movement of movements is identifying all the multiple players around the world that are moving towards similar outcomes and may have theories of change that may be similar as well and may combine towards a large movement. And just 2 years ago, Praveen Nahar and I met with a group of other foundation leaders and systems change thinkers, futurists, and we were the token designers. And they brought Praveen into Ontario and met with me and about 20 others on Wasson Island to develop the ideas around the field of systems change. And so out of this retreat, there's been work through the McConnell Foundation, primarily. There's been other work in parallel that I do need to mention in our community. So here in Toronto, we have a group called Systems Thinking Ontario, collaboratively developed by David Ng and I, really led a lot of work by David over the last, over this same period, over the last 3 years. He's been doing work on systems changes, specifically on how multiple systems have multiple change trajectories. And this is a collaborative open research project. This has also been presented at RSD. But the big questions that we have to deal with here are, what systems are we changing in? Which system? Who participates in the systems? Who decides what change is valuable? What counts as change? What changes count in the system? By when does it count? And so we have to take into account new systems theory for this. We're still, when we think about systems change and the logic of system change models, a lot of times we're still working with, not that it's bad, but we have this accumulation of the history of systems theory. And so David has been looking at, and with his team, moving from kind of the classical first generation systems, Churchman's systems approach, wicked problems, systems thinking, into holons, ecological models, hierarchy theory, resilience, second order cybernetics. So I'm putting that out there. You can look, we can discuss this later, but I can't really get in. This is going to be a top level, even though there's a lot more to say here. We could probably do a new conference on this, but let me just say how this breaks out for me. I see in the emerging theories of change, systemic theories of change, maybe we have 4 sense-making logics. There's the action outcome, the influence pathways, processes within complexity, where we're changing through process, and the coordination of movements. And I'll just touch on these really briefly and then see and present something of some of the pictures that go along with it, some visual arguments. Action outcome, and I'll present some models I'm very familiar with. This action outcome is a series of simple steps that can be developed from forward forecast modeling or backcasting. It's meant to communicate clearly, a simple process model of a series of actions leading to, peace in the world, worldwide adoption, as you see in this one. Forward or back logic can be used here, and this is kind of a combination of both. This is showing from the left to the right, where the envisioned outcome is at the top and the left, and we can kind of think back to the stages of development that are required to achieve, flourishing enterprises through the toolkits and system models that we can develop, and staging these from a hierarchy of levels from lower to higher. And this is, and you could also see other highly structured step-by-step theories of change that are similar. Influence pathways are very popular and take into account influence diagrams and causal loops and other familiar models that we embed within gigamaps very often. It's a simple formalism that can lead to much more complex modeling, directed graphs of networks of influence that can show the potential for emergence, for leverage in the system. We can show influence networks, social networks and their relationships, cycles and loops for reinforcing actions towards change. And we can support a progressive, this supports these models. So the one on the top is, actually both of these are from Ryan Murphy. So I would want to say that the one on the top is actually from their synthesis map in the systemic design course, where that I teach at OCAD, that they developed a much larger map with this embedded influence diagram that shows changing the system of entrepreneurship for much better innovation, state-sponsored innovation in Canada. And in the bottom, a newer thinking around how causal loops can be integrated within simplified but meaningful storytelling, visual storytelling that takes into account influence and causal loops in more of a kind of a systemogram approach, a left to right logic of the influence of the progressive influence of change. And these can be abductive, that is, as we make progress in any of these actions, that progress feeds back into learning and enhances the progress in each one of these bubbles. So systemograms, causal loop diagrams, interpretive structural modeling, and you can look at our methods for developing these, and you can look at some of our some work that Ryan and I and of course David Ings from before, but in terms of models we published about these. Now these can become very complex diagrams, and this is a real one that we're working with in the Bounce Beyond program. So this is a project of about a dozen kind of high-level change makers working on a program idea for and proposing ways of identifying and elevating the next generation economic systems that are already being formed in bioregions and regions and small countries in the world, This is not the next global economy, but the way that life-centered economies are starting to form. And that's our system map of an influence network for how that might be achieved. This is the sketch note. And so which one do you think is, we're actually speaking to more when we're talking to funders and other people and, networks and making presentations? We actually use the sketch note as an integration of the systemic theories of change. And there are multiple. I won't describe the whole sketch note, but you can get an idea from the bounce and even the framing of bouncing beyond from as beyond not bouncing back, but bouncing beyond the post-COVID crisis into new economies which might form out of this approach. And so it incorporates crossing the chasm, the three horizons model, a theory of change for connect, amplify, and integrate for developing infrastructures. And for systems change for flourishing futures. So everything is in this sketch note, and it can be discussed as so. That is, we can just use the sketch note as the only slide even. But it isn't a single theory change, it's a hybrid. And so this might be an approach that we might consider. And if we look at, then I mentioned three horizons. I won't discuss this as a theory of change because it's not actually. It's a model of foresight, vision-based foresight for trends and potentials that will change through phase changes over long periods of time that theories of change can be applied to. So this is a way we can apply theories of change to complexity as processes within that social complexity. And I really advocate three horizons. That's climate change, or that's a municipal level climate change planning approach. And so each of the stages in the three horizons, from the red to the blue to the green lines over a 30-year period, take into account necessary theories of change that we might consider for actual actions, and the actions are shown in that model. And then finally, movement coordination. And this one comes out of the SDG Transformations Forum. And I won't walk you through the logic of this, but you get, because this also embeds structural theories of change, that is how changes in systems occur. But it's the visual approach is one of building a larger movement towards a huge impact in sustainable development goals by providing infrastructure and deep system support for SDG movements going in the same direction. And so movement coordination is very much like the movement of movements that the McConnell Foundation approach was representing. And so these are systemic movements that are approaches that take into account transformation, not just incremental change or reform, creating comprehensive processes, developing large support programs that can support the an overall movement and the participants in that movement, which we would call deep systems. And so this SDG Transformations Forum is actually what led to the Bounce Beyond. And so the Bounce Beyond is now like a change program, a 2-year program within this much larger framework. And so just a few points on how these are factors and elements of systemic theories of change that we ought to be looking at. So the scale of impact, that is, what are the boundaries, the units of analysis, how do we define the system of change itself, where are we changing? So I show a picture or a model from the Systemic Design Toolkit of a popular technique of iterative inquiry, where we can use these types of models to identify the outer boundary for change impact. And we can work with stakeholders to define systems change contexts. So we can define or agree to define where that might be. We have different modes of change. So transition design and modes of transition. So this is also another diagram from, this is the last stage in the Systemic Design Toolkit. It's also relevant to the multi-level perspective of Jan Gehl's. And so this takes into account different modes of systemic change. So how do we make interventions? What are action cycles, transitions and transition design, riding adaptive cycles, and how, like the panarchy is a very popular model for this, social evolution into social complexity, adapting foresight, strategic systemic foresight in 3 horizons, and similar models for scenarios, accounting for impact cascades, learning systems, disruption, coercion. So I just say, don't choose a theory of change model until you know your theory of action. And then finally, change happens within the social system itself. So who changes in the social system? This is another socio-ecological model also that I use a lot, but also is embedded in Systemic Design Toolkit, that we can map out and work with stakeholders as the participants in social change up to the levels. And we can also identify structure and agency relationships. That is, who is leading the change. And I have some proposals there. So if we bring all those together, we can look at this later as well, but an early ontology might be, there are a number of factors to consider. All of these that are presented before, they could be perhaps mapped out into, I mean, this is a very early attempt to kind of map out the scope of areas of relationships of access to power, of the scale the scale of impact of standing. So where do participants actually have access in the community, or the blue on the right, power on the left, the scale of power, the time horizons. These are all relevant to systemic theories of change. So finally, I would just sum up by saying, you know, at RSD, we do recognize in many ways are developing context, you know, the development of our work in addressing multi-scale human, social, ecological system complexity across a lot of contexts. It's not enough that we're using state-of-the-art practices, all the ones that we've developed. We have to translate and adapt these to interpret them better in the practice context that we're working with. And so I would just say we can do better than muddle through incrementalism as well. So we can develop these types of models that will work in the new context of our sponsors, funders, and research programs. So let's start to research and work together on the systemic theories of change for transformation. And I would invite your participation in this as something of a program going into the future. And thank you.
Thanks, Peter, for opening up lots of possible points of dialogue there that we can interact with. Lots of juicy things to dig into and unpack. Christine had a first question that came in around, how are you understanding the social change sector kind of digging into this? From your understanding, how are they kind of developing these systems approaches and kind of bringing forward these theories of change? Do you have any insight into that process?
Yes, there are a number of kind of think tanks that have also started to develop within the foundations themselves. So McConnell Foundation, I think in Canada is really, I think, one of the leading groups and thinkers in this area. And their programs on, you know, the future of cities and new economies and the Nourish program, which has also been led by and developed and led by the theory of, I mean, I should have used their theory of change because Haley LaPalme proposed the Nourish program at RSD4 in Banff. And now it's actually kind of one of McConnell's leading exemplars of a complete program which has accomplished its theory of change within a few short years, within a single funding cycle, and it's into another funding cycle. So Haley and Cheryl Sue from Haley took our systemic design course and developed some of these ideas within RSD. And I think I probably could do a whole talk just on their project, but I'd say this is exemplary of where they're going because they've had some successes in actual systemic theory, systemic change. And I'll say why Nourish was successful is that it found a very effective point of intervention, which was the goal of increasing transforming the healthiness of food available in in public sector context. So at first hospitals, but then in the future, schools and other public sector purchasing, and to create public purchasing that will draw on local and locally sourced foods in away from kind of large agribusiness. And this is, and so by working with food, the point of purchase and changing procurement mechanisms, and then creating new menus and creating new food webs and support and sources, they've started to develop this across Canada. So they even had Peter Senge speak at their kind of final presentation within their community of practice. So I think there's a lot to learn from some of the successful projects. Now there are much larger projects in this. I mean, Nourish is you can find the example on the website with, if you search Nourish, there are other Nourish projects, but Nourish Canada, and food procurement, I think would get you there. But I think all of the major funders really are now looking at systems change. I mean, many of them were in the room in this, in some of the, there have been, I think, a number of developmental mini conferences or retreats like the one that Praveen and I were invited to participate in. But these have been developing kind of, I guess, social change think tanks in a way that, including the School of, the Academy of Systems Change and Institute for the Future and School of Systems, I think it's the School of Systems Change and the Academy of Systems Change, which are one in the Academy in the UK and the school in the US, which Peter Senge works with, that are working collaboratively also with, supporting the ideas in this area.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Peter. Yeah. Those are some good examples and things for people to follow up on. We had so many different links being shared during your talk as well. So there's a lot being dug into within that space, and you presented a number of other examples there, which is great. In your talk, you mentioned something about needing kind of a logic or a theory of action before, or the value of having a theory of action before moving into a theory of change. And I think I want to dig into this because Gordon asks a provocative question around that and says, wouldn't the opposite also be reasonable? And so can you unpack that a little bit? Why do you think you need a theory of action before a theory of change?
Well, let's say that it's abductive, but I'd say don't choose a theory of change model. That is to know which one is, I think that there are more than these four, but these four I've been able to assign most of the models for theories of change to these kind of four categories. And so I think sometimes in the discussions with potential program sponsors or in our understanding of the kind of cognitive limits of a research sponsor, we will oversimplify the logic of our proposed change outcomes or the proposed vision for a system change or even a research project. And I think that we tend to oversimplify so that we can match the logic and the mental models that we know exist with those sponsors, those potential sponsors, is we know what type of pitch or what type of presentation, we get feedback on presentations to simplify things, make it clear to people in business or to people in who are working with foundations. So I think it's great that foundations are now really taking into account, systemic theories of change, but still in developing a deeper understanding of what it is that we're proposing and how to align our change proposals to the plans and design approaches. We need to understand, I think, what types of influences and impacts, what types of interventions we believe we might really be making and invest in. I mean, one of the things I see very frequently in these types of projects is that we'll spend a lot of time and of course money doing system mapping. And sometimes that system mapping is just kind of vague. It's like, well, first to understand the system, we will do large scale system mapping, but that can last a year or so. I mean, deep system mapping can become its own project. and you know, as you know from my work, I believe that we need to find ways to do rapid system mapping and find ways to create visual narratives that then can be interpolated and interpreted by the stakeholders. So the synthesis map approach, or the gigamap, the synthesis map being one we can develop as a project team, as a research team even, and present to stakeholders and then iterate. The gigamap being one that's done with the stakeholders directly themselves. And so I think these approaches are different, need to be explained better, but they also take into account they aren't the intervention themselves, they're ways of finding the interventions. And so we have this abductive reasoning problem of we don't know the system well enough till we map it to know exactly where the best interventions are. So we need to do some prior work to be able to map that out. We also need to be able to envision what types of influence actions we think will make the most difference. I mean, just look at this list. We can't do all these, right? So we need to have a theory, we need to have a kind of theory of what actions will make a difference and which ones will make the most difference and how we incorporate those into our design planning. And then our theory of action can be our theory of change can be worked out of that action model.
Great. And I think that abductive part that Ryan's capturing in the chat there, of the in between, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks, Peter. Last question, and if I can ask you to keep this one somewhat succinct, because we want to move on to the tracks and things, and we have to stay on time today because we've got quite a short order of things. But last question from Maya about how do you see these new theories of change as capturing the dynamics of behavior, or are they still kind of capturing a certain point in time? And this also came up in, Maria, in your presentation around the lines that you talked about loving, and somebody wrote, yeah, and the lines themselves are almost systems and dynamic in-betweens back and forth. So are we there yet, Peter, in terms of capturing dynamics in these theories of change, or where are we at?
I'll try to, just really simply, maybe not. I mean, that's why I'd like to put this on our agenda as continuing to work forward, and why I've left these models to look in this kind of ontology as an early ontology. It's a summary of some of the factors and how they might be represented. And when we look at the actual models, some of them take into account more complexity. There's no best fit. It's going to be, yeah, there's no best fit systemic theory of change anyway, because the fit of the visual story and of the argument has to match the has to inspire the understanding and the thinking of the program sponsors and the stakeholders themselves. And so this should be used in the visualizations that we're developing ought to be commensurate with the learning of mental models, not of matching kind of the current understanding of the system. We should be pushing our understanding of how systems change can develop. And that's why I think David Ng's projects and what Ryan Murphy's working with and things like the Bounce Beyond, we're constantly thinking about how to incorporate. It isn't about new ideas to make them better. We're continuing to work with what we've developed to interrogate it, to map it better to the potential outcomes. So these are tools for dialogue as much as anything. And it creates, I think these also then lead to a different, more partnership approach with our R&D and our program sponsors. So if you're writing like, a research council proposal where you don't get to talk with them, you just got one chance. I think if we develop better theories of change that we can actually get in the literature and say, this is our systemic theory of change, and why, and that we're following something that's been documented, we have a good chance of that theory, or a good chance of that type of proposal being accepted because we've established a beachhead in the literature. When we're working with foundations, we're developing partnerships these days because they really want to know and work with you on, and know you well and know you're thinking about the potential for, large scale change in some of these very large projects.
Great. Thank you, Peter. I think it's interesting how we're kind of bringing these mental models forward, but maybe we haven't quite arrived yet, as you say, and this is the work of the community. So thank you very much. I loved how these kind of different plenary presentations, we had a kind of deep zoom in on a particular project and a practice, and a zoom out on more analytical around how we're kind of framing these things. And I'd love to think about a theory of change for your work, Maria, or how do we kind of do that and articulate that. But thank you, Peter and Maria, very much for your presentations.